Hey everyone, Rob here from Gunfather Milsim, and today is part 2 of my Airsoft sniper rifle series on setup. Mostly we're going to cover mounting a scope on your Airsoft sniper rifle and then zeroing that scope. So there's a lot of things we're going to talk about. I'm going to try to keep it down to 15 minutes. We could probably talk about this for an hour if we were talking about real steel, but a lot of the stuff that applies to real steel scopes does not apply to Airsoft scopes, and a lot of it only applies nominally to it. And stuff like that, like parallax, we're just going to brush over it real quick to save a lot of time. And honestly, it's just real boring and doesn't apply to Airsoft. Alright? Now, so here we got our Airsoft sniper rifle. We got our scope ready to go. And we want to mount it specific to our body and our eye so everything's more comfortable and it works better when we're playing. The first thing we're going to do is set up our eye relief. Now, what is eye relief? This is your ocular lens, alright? Now, it's designed to be looked through at a certain specific distance. It's called the eye box. Okay, so there's a distance in here that works ideally when you're looking through it. If you're not in that correct distance, you're going to see what they call a lot of scope shadow. It's a lot of blackness coming in. So if your eye's too close or too far away, you're going to see scope shadow. It's not going to be a nice, full, clear image. Now, the way we set this is we turn our scope up to the maximum magnification. In this case, it's 16. Okay, so we're going to have our scope maximum magnification because that's when that eye box is the smallest, the least forgiving, even though we're probably never going to use our scope at that magnification when we're playing. And we're going to mount our rings up and we're going to screw them down real light. Okay, so you can still move the scope a little bit. And then we're going to put our eye behind here. Once again at maximum magnification, we're going to move this scope back and forth until we find the spot where we have no scope shadow. Alright? Don't be concerned about left or right or tilt or if that reticle is perfectly lined up right now. We'll cover that later. Once you've figured out your ideal spot for eye relief where you're looking through the scope and you have no scope shadow on your highest magnification setting, you're going to tighten down your scope mounts. Okay? Now you don't want to ratchet them all the way down because we still got to do some little movements of this scope when we're setting it up. You just want to tighten it down just so it's a little bit firm, but still so you reach up here and you can move the scope a little bit left and right. Alright? Now some of you're probably going to want to mark with a marker, like right here, where your scope is lined up right now for ideal eye relief. Just in case it gets moved later, you don't have to repeat this step over and over and over again, alright? So that's your eye relief. The next thing we're going to set up is our comb height, okay? And what I'm talking about here is the height of this stock. So when you relax and you're resting on the stock and you look through that scope, you don't see any scope shadow to the top or bottom. Alright? Now, it's going to vary a lot from person to person depending on how you put your face on the stock, the shape of your face, and how you look through the glass. That's all going to affect it. For this rifle, I have this really nifty Magpul padded stock piece. I like it a lot, but I bought some new rings for this rifle. The old rings were a little bit lower and I couldn't use this because it was too high. And as nice and as comfy as this thing is, if it's not going to work for me when I'm looking through that scope, I'm not going to use it. So on my old scope, I used a custom one. Now the way you put together a custom one, lots of different ways. Lots of guys just throw some padding on there and throw some duct tape on it. I like to do it a little bit nicer than that, but what you need is padding. Okay. I think this is an old camping mat that I had from years ago. You can also use like a yoga mat. Buy them from Walmart, they're cheap. Cut them up, use the exact amount you want. You don't want to put more padding on there than you need. And you want different thicknesses to play with so you can add different thicknesses to find out what's good for you. So basically you're gonna prone out, you're gonna look behind the scope, and based on where you see scope shadow, you're either going to add padding or remove padding until you're looking through it and there's no scope shadow whatsoever. And you're going to want to attach that padding to your stock. I like this stuff. It's a self-adhering bandage. You can buy it at Walgreens or any drugstore. Works great, and the nice thing about it is one, it holds really tight, and you can also throw paint on it when you're painting your rifle, and it holds spray paint real well, like Krylon, so it'll look real nice when you're done. So it'll all match the body of your rifle. And it holds up really well too, and it's cheap. The next thing we're going to set up is your ocular focus. That's the focus right back here. Okay, It can screw back and forth. Not all scopes are going to have this. Really low-end, cheap airsoft scopes, probably not going to have it. Low-power scopes like a 4-power, not going to have it. Okay, this is just specific to, I wouldn't even say high-end scopes, but I'd say entry-level to medium and up scopes are going to have an ocular focus. Yours might not. All the ocular focus is about is making sure that reticle is nice and clear. Okay, so the way we set this is we want to look at something with no features. So I always use the sky. So it's featureless sky, no clouds. And you're going to look through there and you're going to look at the reticle and make sure it's clear. Now here's the problem, is your eye is really good at putting things in focus that are out of focus. Alright? So if I look through it, it might be a little bit fuzzy at first, and then all of a sudden it'll come in clear. And you think, well, you know, my ocular focus is good to go. Wrong. Your eye is doing the work that the ocular focus should be. And if you have a scope that's like that, it's going to eventually wear on your eye, and your eye is going to get really tired after you look through it for a long time because your eye is straining the whole time to keep that reticle in focus. So what you want to do is take a little quick looks at it. Just look at it and then go off the scope, and look at it and go off the scope. So you want to get off the scope before your eye has a chance to change the focus on that reticle. And you keep making little adjustments to it until you can look at it and it's in focus right off the bat when you look at it. Once you set that focus like that, what you want to do is just set it. And some guys just put a black line on it. Some people tape it because you're never going to move it again. Once it's set for your eye, it's set for your eye. I painted this scope and I set the ocular focus before I painted it. So if it moves, I can see the black line that's going to appear. And that's how I know my ocular focus is off. Once again, once it's set, you're never going to move it again. So our ocular focus is set. Now we're going to talk about leveling the scope, and this is the trickiest part. Now remember, we're going to have our scope mounts dialed down just enough so we can still move the scope a little bit, but I don't want it moving all over the place. Alright? There's two methods of doing this, and here is where airsoft differs wildly from real steel. In real steel, the bullet doesn't care which way the rifle is canted as it leaves the barrel, because gravity is going to pull on the bullet the same way, regardless. When I mount this rifle into my shoulder, it's going to have a natural cant left or right. And if it has a cant less than 3 degrees, it's kind of imperceivable by the human eye. But I've found that my rifles cant left about 2 degrees when they're set up for me. Now that's no problem when you're shooting real steel. You just turn your scope 2 degrees the other way so you're still lined up with the force of gravity. That way when you make adjustments on your scope, they're true to the force of gravity and true to the force that's pulling down the bullet. All that is irrelevant in airsoft because we're not going to dial in anything. We're not going to dial any longer ranges, so we don't have to have those clicks be true to the force of gravity. What we do have is we have a hop-up. And the hop-up unit in here, obviously, is what gives us our backspin. And for that backspin to be effective and give us maximum range, it has to be straight up and down. Now there's two methods to leveling your scope we're going to talk about. The first one, you got to go to Lowe's or Home Depot or something, pick up 2 of these little levels. They only cost like $5 each. Alright, great investment. Now, in some cases your scope mount's going to be high enough or your rail's going to be long enough that you're going to have a flat spot on your rifle that you can put this little level and make your rifle level. In my case I can't, but I'm going to explain it to you anyway. Basically what you're going to set it up with some sandbags or clothes or whatever you have to level out your rifle on a table. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to make sure your rifle is level lengthwise. Once you're sure it's level there, turn it, put it on that rail or whatever's flat, and make sure there's no cant left or right. So what we're going to do is we're going to move that scope until it's level. Okay? So we know the rifle's level lengthwise and left and right, and we also know our scope is level. Then we're going to tighten down these scope mounts. Now this is the tricky part. You're going to want to tighten them down to spec. Do not over tighten your scope mounts. If you over torque them, you're going to risk damaging that scope. Ask me how I know. So it's worth spending the extra money to get yourself a torque wrench so you don't ever screw this up. These are pretty affordable. You can go buy them at Cabela's. This is a Wheeler. I think it costs like 25 bucks. It's worth the investment so you don't break your scopes and so you make sure everything works correctly when you're tightening down a scope. Now, I don't know what the specs are for every manufacturer. For Vortex, they're 16 to 18 inch-pounds, closer to the 16. You probably wouldn't be wrong to just use that as a general rule for all scopes. I'm sure you'll be just fine. Over-tightening is definitely going to hurt you more than under-tightening. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to tighten down your scope mounts, and then you're going to want to double check. You got to be careful. A lot of times when you tighten down that last screw, it'll actually torque the scope over a little bit and it'll knock it out of whack. So always double check with your levels and by looking through it when you're done and make sure everything is nice and clean and level. Now, that's kind of a complicated process, and honestly it's kind of a pain in the ass. So now I'm going to go to the second method, which is the method I prefer, which is you just use a plumb bob. Now what's a plumb bob? It's a weight tied at the bottom of a rope, and you hang it out there and gravity pulls on the rope, and that line is going to be, that rope is going to be absolutely straight with the force of gravity, and that's what you want. So on my range I have a plumb bob set up, and it's just a rope hanging from a tree with a weight at the bottom. And the only reason it's out there is so I can zero scopes. You want to zero it about at least 30 yards away, and you want your rope to be at least 6 feet long. So how are we going to zero our scope with the plumb bob? We're going to get nice and comfortable. We're going to either sit prone or in a sitting position or whatever position you're going to shoot from most in the field. And you're going to line up that scope on that plumb bob, and you're going to make sure that your reticle, the vertical reticle, lines up perfectly with that rope. Now, real steel, I can cant the rifle and it doesn't matter. I can cant it to where it's most comfortable. Airsoft, once again, because of our hop-up, and that hop-up needs to be perfectly straight, this rifle needs to be perfectly straight, so as straight as you can. You can also use the level if you want to, but for my purposes I find it's easier just hold it perfectly straight, line up the plumb bob, tighten down the scope, right? Once again, remember when you tighten down the scope, double check when you're done, because that last little tightening of that screw can cause that scope to cant. Alright? So now that we've leveled our scope, we got that all set up, only one last thing we need to set up, and that is our objective focus, okay? Commonly called parallax. Parallax adjustment. It's generally over here on your scope. It's on your left side. Some of your cheaper lower end scopes, it's going to be up here on the front. It's going to be a big knob on the front. It's going to see a bunch of numbers. It's usually in yards, and the farthest number is going to be a little infinity symbol. Alright? Now, this is one of those things that's really critical to precision rifle shooting at longer ranges, but not that important in airsoft. So most time people are going to refer to it as an objective focus or just a focus, but it's actually a parallax adjustment. So what you're going to want to do for our purposes is pick a range that you shoot stuff at most. For me, it's about 75 yards. I find something 75 yards away, and I'm going to adjust that parallax until whatever is at 75 yards away is perfectly dialed into focus. Then I'm going to look through the scope, put the reticle on that object. I'm going to move my eye behind the scope without nudging the rifle and moving the rifle at all. And that reticle should stay perfectly glued on that target as I move my eye around behind the scope. Okay? If it moves at all, then your parallax is off. Basically what your parallax adjustment is doing is it's adjusting the plane of the reticle onto the target. Once again, I get into a really long explanation about it, but it doesn't really apply to airsoft. So I would just set that to where it's focused at the range you shoot at most. Leave it, don't ever screw with it again. All right? So with that, our scope is totally set up. All right? We've set up our eye relief back and forth so we don't have any scope shadow. We've set up our cone height so we don't have any scope shadow up or down. We've set up our ocular focus so our reticle is nice and clear. We've leveled our scope so it's perfectly straight with our hop up, and our BBs are going to be nice and straight all the way down, assuming your hop up is straight. And we've set up our parallax adjustment to the range that we're going to shoot at most of the time. So now it's time to zero it. Now you're going to hear a lot of different opinions on how you should zero airsoft rifles in general and airsoft sniper rifles in particular. Here's my advice, and it's going to differ from what you're hearing from a lot of places. A lot of guys are like, oh, I want to zero in at 50 yards or 100 yards, ranges that are really extreme. The problem is that airsoft rifles are not very precise. and by contrast, your scope is a relatively precise instrument. So you're trying to add a precision scope to a non-precise projectile. It's not going to work at those ranges, because at those long ranges there's so many different factors, hop up, wind, temperature, that are affecting the flight of that BB, that you're just going to drive yourself nuts trying to zero that thing in. My recommendation on how I do it is zero my scope at 30 feet. What I want to do at that range is zero a little bit low, and the reason is because this scope is higher than the muzzle of this gun. That's all. Okay? And if you want to get really hardcore, you can measure this distance, and it's probably going to be about 2 inches. So at 30 feet, I want to be about 2 inches low. Try to get as tight a group as possible as I can, dead center, 2 inches from my point of aim. Now the way I'm going to adjust it is I'm going to take the caps off my turrets, and don't overthink this. If you want the BBs to go left, you put clicks left. If you want it to go up, you put clicks up. It's that simple. So when you're adjusting your scope, it's generally going to say, most say 1/4 MOA at 100 yards. 1 MOA is 1 inch at 100 yards, so 1/4 MOA is 1/4 of an inch at 100 yards. But we're not zeroing at 100 yards, we're zeroing at 30 feet. Which means we're going to have a lot more clicks to get to that 1/4 inch or whatever we're trying to get to. And I mean a lot more clicks. Generally you're looking at 20 clicks is what you're going to need for an inch at 30 feet. So you're going to have to dial in quite a few clicks to get that thing to move. So don't be shy, and don't be counting 1, 2, 3, 4 and then shoot again, because it's not going to move at all at 30 feet. So generally I'll crank it quite a bit to get it moving quickly, and then once I get kind of close, then I'll start going, 4 to 8 clicks to really get it dialed in. Now, so I'm 2 inches low at 30 feet, but I'm dead center. Now once I've zeroed my scope at 30 feet, now I'm going to confirm my zero at further distances. I usually do 100 feet, 150 feet, and 200 feet. Now understand that since you're shooting farther and there's more factors such as hop up coming into play and wind coming into play, it's going to move a little bit. Obviously you want to try to do this on a windless day, but it is what it is. So I want to try to make sure I'm still putting those BBs generally where I want, but understand they're going to spread out. Now if you try to shoot 200 feet and try to adjust your scope at 200 feet, you're going to drive yourself nuts, because it's an imprecise projectile. You're going to have so many factors that you're not going to be able to compensate for all those factors simply by making your little clicks. Alright, so now we got our scope all dialed in. We've zeroed it at 30 feet. We've confirmed at 100 and 200. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going to use this scope when we play. Now, understand that scopes are designed for real steel bullets that do not travel with the same trajectories as airsoft BBs. It is not apples and apples. Okay, so you might think that it's cool that I can dial in my elevation as the BB goes farther, but that's not how it works. And you're not, if it makes it fun for you, then by all means have at it, but that's not a realistic application of the scope. What I try to do, and what I find works best for me, is I want to keep the BB in sight through the scope throughout its entire trajectory at the magnification I play at, which for me is about 6 times most of the time. So I shoot that BB. I usually want it to start out a little bit low under the reticle, and the hop-up's going to pull it up just over the reticle, and I'm going to watch that BB through the rest of its flight. So through the reticle, it's either going to be just below or just above. I'm less concerned about my elevation because I can adjust that pretty easily. I'm more concerned about my windage left and right. So I want it to be dead center all the way down through its trajectory so I can observe the BB all the way through its flight. Therefore, I'm not going to make any adjustments to that scope while I'm playing, with the exception of magnification. Alright folks, that's all I got for setting up your scope on your sniper rifle. I hope you found this helpful, and hopefully it can make you more accurate while you're out there playing. Thanks for watching.